All right. Welcome, ladies, to the first episode of the Hourly to Exit podcast. I am so honored to have with me today Jaclyn Mellone, who also happens to be my business coach, and I'm so happy to have you with me. Thank you so much, Jaclyn.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
Jaclyn is such an impressive woman. I want to give you a little taste of her biography here. Jaclyn Mellone is the founder of Go To Gal Media, business coach for entrepreneurs, and host of the Go To Gal podcast. Go To Gal has been named one of the Forbes Top 21 podcasts for 2021 and is a top 200 marketing podcast on iTunes. Jaclyn works with experts around the globe to help them become the go to authority in their space. Her approach combines business strategy with mindset practices to help her clients bust through their blocks and exponentially grow their business. She's been featured in Forbes, Entrepreneur, Yahoo Finance, Reader's Digest, Parents, and has spoken at marketing conferences around the US. Jaclyn has proudly built the go to empire in her slippers. I love that. From her home in Rochester, New York, where she lives with her husband and two children and a fur baby, which I can confirm loves to be on camera. So,
He's more like a fur old man these days, but he's always my baby.
yes, like seeing her kind of swaddle him. It's a girl or boy?
It's a boy, but
Boy, yes.
he's a little white fluffy pup, so people think he
Yes,
looks kind of
yes.
girly, but
And
he's a
definitely her
boy.
fur baby. So once again, thank you again for being here with me, Jaclyn. So today we're going to talk about mindset. And but before we get started, I just wanted to like touch on, both of our businesses are focused on women. And it certainly is, I don't want to say it's a trend because there's always been women who focus on women, but we hear a lot more about it, I think, recently. And there are very real differences between the way women think about business and the way men think about business. And so I'd love to hear about, how you decided to go kind of into female entrepreneur focus. Although I know you have go-to guys as well. You're not just go-to gals, but I know you have some guys too. But focusing mostly on female entrepreneurs, like how you came to that and how that's affected your business.
Ooh, I love this question, and it does seem like a trend now. And I wonder if it's because people who had a similar situation than I did. So before I started Go To Gal, I was working in commercial real estate, which is very predominantly male industry, and most of the people in that industry were not only men but significantly older than me. I helped my dad start the business back in 2004, went and did marketing for several different entrepreneurs for a few years. And then I ended up back helping him with the business and doing real estate before I started this business. And I saw the close personal connections that my dad had and my cousin too, who worked with us, who is a man, and they would go on these golf things. And sure, women could come, but it wasn't really right. Like they weren't really invited. I didn't golf, so I was never like feeling left out. But I realized I could never have the close personal connection and the way that they were with other people in the industry. And that was something that bugged me a little bit. And it wasn't that I wanted to be part of that circle, but I didn't see other people like me in the industry that I could be building the close relationships with that could help me in business the way that I saw it helping them. And listen, my dad is my number one fan, and he has done everything his entire life to help me in whatever way he could, right? So I had a ton of advantages in this industry, and I had a lot of success in the industry too. So it wasn't like that was the case. But when I started my own business, I wanted to be able to connect with women in that way. Also realized that I was in a local community group called Rochester Women's Network, and I saw how things were different in a space that was just women and how women felt more comfortable opening up or sharing, or conversations that weren't happening when I was in these other rooms that were mostly men, or sometimes I was the only woman in the room. I also had some situations where, even at events with my dad and cousin there, I had situations with men being very inappropriate with me and making me feel uncomfortable, and advances and from a very young age, because I started in this industry while I was still in college. Up until, when I came back, I was late 20s. And so I think there was a form of just, if I create a business that is for women, then I don't have to worry about being in those awkward situations or those scary situations where, I may have felt more vulnerable if I was in a different situation. So a lot of different reasons, but I wonder, I know I'm not alone in those feelings. And so I wonder if some of those bad experiences or that left out or feeling unwelcome or just feeling uncomfortable has led more women to create businesses that are almost like a protective shell, if you will.
Yes. I agree completely. I also kind of came up, as a lawyer, and I have been a lawyer for 30 years, so it has changed quite a bit in that time. But it was not at all unusual for me to be the only woman in a room, and there is kind of that shared language of gender, for lack of a better term, that sometimes you are excluded from. And so when I thought about transitioning from a very traditional kind of legal practice to one that is more consultative and thinking about who I would want to work with, it very naturally came to want to work with women. One, I think it's an underserved kind of demographic, especially in the exit planning space. Not that there aren't female exit planners, but a lot of the conversation around exits are about, these gigantic multiples and the bro culture. And there are a lot of things that are associated that are almost negative about kind of planning for an exit. That's almost kind of predatory, that you're just building it just to sell it as opposed to building it for the love of it. And so I wanted to have those types of conversations that I think that we could have, among women. So that's, yeah, very similar experience. So let's talk about mindset then. And so, I mean, back to them, I'm going to stick with the male female dynamic here for just a second, is, I feel like we hear about women's mindset issues a lot more than we hear about men's. Why do you think that is?
I don't think men are as comfortable talking about it. It's interesting. So I have significantly more experience working with women with mindset than I do with men. However, I have been in masterminds with women and men, right, where we're talking about these things. And I have some friends in the industry too who are men who, because I talk about things, right, they'll say, "Oh, I was listening to this episode of yours," and bring up something. And then in my personal life too, having these conversations. What I've realized is I think a lot of the mindset struggles are actually very similar between men and women. I think different personality types, whether you're a man or a woman, right, are going to kind of help us see which type of mindset things are going to come up and struggle with the most. But the way that we respond or show that type of mindset struggle, the way it shows up for us and how we react to it can look very different between men and women. But I think that a lot of it is just having the cultures. And so culturally here, especially in the United States, growing up, men were told not to show emotion. And so they were shoving that down, or it comes out as anger. And then anger is very much an emotion. Oh, right. And so I think it's starting to realize, okay, whoever you are, if you're a man or you're a woman, or you're non-binary, however, realizing what it is, what are your telltale signs that something's going on emotionally? Because we all have different ways of whether we're avoiding something, right? Or whether we're feeling resentful or angry, or we're feeling shame and guilt, we're going to have these emotions come up. But that's not the key of what's really going on underneath. And so I think it's starting to explore, okay, what are those things that are showing up that are indicators of something's going on here, right? Where we can see, okay, what's under the surface with the mindset.
Well, I do want to talk about what kind of what those categories of issues are, how you see them. And I will, confess that, I work with Jaclyn. She is my coach, and we have, discussed some mindset issues. And I never thought of myself as having mindset issues, honestly. You know, I'm a lawyer. I feel pretty confident. I, have had my own business. I've had to make tough tough conversations, had to negotiate, fees with clients, had to, do kind of the have those difficult conversations. And I feel like my what I do is valuable, and that, I don't I'm not afraid of, kind of and but then I wish I could remember what those things have been where you were just like, yeah, either I wasn't doing something, or, and that there was some resistance, which I kind of thought was just, well, I got all this stuff going on. You're like, no, there's something else going on here, and being able, so even those of us who feel relatively confident in our abilities and in our ability to negotiate. I mean, I'm a lawyer after all. Like, still, like, there's stuff under there. So, yeah, how does it present itself when you?
It presents itself in so many ways. Oh my goodness, all the ways, right? And it can be sneaky. There are going to be people that are like, yes, I'm struggling with mindset, and they're really aware of that. But there's also going to be times where, so one of the ways that, so self-sabotage is a big thing that is mindset related, but that doesn't always show up as being mindset related, right? So for me personally, one of my favorite ways to self-sabotage is my brain. When let's say I'm in the middle of a launch and I really need to be focused on something, my brain is like, oh, what about this other new idea? What about, and so it's masked as creativity, right? And it took me a while to realize this, because it's not showing up as, oh, I can't do this launch or no one's going to buy from me. It's showing up as, right? So what happens, you start a launch, you feel vulnerable, right? You're outside of your comfort zone. But for me, it wasn't this feeling of, oh, what if I don't hit my goal? It was, ooh, what about this other thing? And that was my brain's way of protecting itself from being vulnerable in the launch, because it is vulnerable putting something out there and not knowing what the outcome is going to be, especially in such a visible way. And so my brain was like, well, we don't have to think about that if we could think about this other more exciting thing. And that distraction was self-sabotage, because it would distract me from focusing on the thing I would need to be successful with it. And so that is, I would say, when it comes to self-sabotage, which is something that we all experience, there's really 3 different categories. So I have a quiz about this, but I'll break it down because I think it's really interesting. So, and the quiz has a fun twist to it. It's, which movie villain is sabotaging your success? Oh, and because, listen, one of the best ways to get yourself to snap out of something is a little bit of humor, right? Like,
Yes.
and so let's have some fun with it. And so why not use some movie villains to distract us? And so the example I was giving, the avoiding of the thing, the avoiding is the tool, if you will, for self-sabotage. That's Ursula. Ursula is in there from Little Mermaid, but she's basically taking your voice away, taking that, right? And taking that, like, distracting you, pulling you into the cave, if you will, or whatnot. Oh, right. But it's setting you up for that. You're not necessarily hearing those thoughts of doubt, and you're not necessarily even feeling the emotions. So it tends to be avoiding the emotion. And so whether that's creativity or eating popcorn or just not doing the task and
Right.
doing like lots of procrastinating, right? It can show up in those ways, and you may not realize in those moments that it is mindset. But when you start to dig a little deeper and understand, oh, that's why I do that, right? Then that knowledge is power to be able to help you realize, okay, well, how can I stop that behavior? So the other 2 examples of this are, so the core feelings would be of anger. And so with that, it's I guess for the villain, it's Miranda Priestley from Devil Wears Prada. But it's that like you're never working. The voice in your head is like, you're never working hard enough. It's never good enough. It's never perfect. And with that, the way that Miranda sabotages you is your intuition. And so typically people that would have Miranda as their inner villain voice would be really intuitive and they're able to trust their gut on things. Mm-hmm. But when Miranda is showing up, she's going to mask that intuition. So the gut feeling is off. And so it's whether that is anger that you're going to, or whether it is, let's say, like impulsively firing a client, or or your gut is like, let's say your team was supposed to do something, they didn't do it right, and it's like, well, no one could do it better than me, I have to stay up all night and do it. And so it's taking you out of that, what you know to be what's best, and masking that, and just this like workhorse type of inner villain that's nothing's ever good enough. So that would be how that type would self-sabotage themselves. And then the other type is, so with that inner villain, it is Regina George from Mean Girls. So like I said,
I've got to brush up on my pop culture. I'm so glad you're explaining.
Gotta have some fun with this. So she is the classic mean girl. And so Regina sabotages your feelings. And so it's really you're feeling guilt and shame, and she's coming in and kind of filling like all of the emotions there. And that is taking you're comparing yourself to other people, or you're thinking you're not good enough. And your heart and how you connect with people that's like the most powerful thing for those types. And when Regina is there and showing up, she's distorting that, right? So instead of your emotions being powerful and being the emotionally intelligent people that they are, that's when the emotion takes over, and it can just be a lot of overwhelming self-doubt, which I don't think I explained with the Ursula type, but that type is more of a like thinking strategy, like that is more of their power, superpower, if you will. And that's what Ursula is masking, because it's the thoughts that are taking them, whether they're creative thoughts or I should do something different thoughts, or whatever that is, it's the thoughts that are distorted. So whether I guess with all the three types, it's either your thoughts that are being distorted, your intuition that's being distorted, or your feelings, your emotions that are being distorted.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I'm an Ursula. But it brings up an interesting question, especially when you mask mindset issues with faux creativity. How do you know when it really is like a better idea? Or is it a mindset issue?
It's so true. And we all have a little bit of all of these, right? But I find that it's understanding your primary type is important, because the same mindset advice does not work for everyone. And so that's why with that quiz, it's like, okay, let's figure out what your type is, and then we can come up with the best solution for it. So navigating that, I think, comes back to a couple different things. One is, okay, well, even if, so you're saying okay, well, what if I just have an inspired idea, right? So here's the thing. This is where being able to be confident in the direction you're going with things, right, is going to allow you to navigate that. Because what happens now, of course it still happens to me. That's how my brain is wired. I can't stop my brain from coming up with the ideas. It's going to happen every single time. Now what I do is I acknowledge it. I write it down. Sometimes I'll even Voxer a friend about it or something. So I have a voice message. I have a recording I capture it, right? Because it is a lot of times really amazing ideas come out of those situations, right? Because it's like this pressure cooker in your brain of having to focus, and through that you get I get really great creative ideas that come from that. But that doesn't mean that I should abandon it. Going back to the launch example, that doesn't mean I should abandon the launch in the middle of it with that new idea, right? That's letting Ursula win. So acknowledging the idea, acknowledging the shiny object, and the dingle hopper for all my Little Mermaid fans out there. And but then being able to, so for me, ideas and creativity inspire me to keep going, right? And so what I tend to do in that situation when it happens during a launch or something like that, where I need to be really on focus, is, okay, how can I get myself back engaged with the launch? And if my only focus is how many sales are coming through, well then, yeah, that's going to be an emotional roller coaster, right? But if I can focus on my own activities, especially if I'm able to tap into different things I can do creatively, or to feel inspired, or even just take care of myself during it, of like, okay, like I'm gonna, go get a massage one of the days, or get a pedicure, or lunch with a girlfriend, right? So being able to focus my energy during it on what I'm doing, what I'm in control of, that allows me to reward myself for the actions, instead of having my emotions be tied to how things went for the launch that day. Specifically speaking, with an online launch, which is probably a very different business model than most of the people listening, but not every day is going to be the same with it, right? So some days there's going to be a lot of sales. Some days there's going to be no sales. There tends to not be any sales for several days in the middle of a launch, right? And so that's setting yourself up for that, like, no emails are coming in, no sales are coming in mentality, where if you're able to focus your energy on something else, for me, that's what tends to work. So I think with these different things, it's just about getting curious, right? I know they say curiosity killed the cat, but I feel like curiosity is just the key to understanding without judgment, to giving us the ability to become observers, instead of putting on the judgment of, oh, I always do this, right? Or like, oh, I'm procrastinating again, or oh, I'm, I blew up at this person on my team, or like, here I am, like feeling sorry for myself, or stuck in comparison. I always do this, and beating ourselves up about it. It allows you to, one of the reasons why I personify these inner villains, as I like to say, that they're not you. It's not you doing that. It's this other character, and it's this fictional kind of fun character, right? Is because, one, it brings it's a little bit light, and it also allows us to step into the observer mode, where we're not judging ourselves, we're not blaming ourselves, but we're able to acknowledge what's going on, and then hopefully be able to use our more logical side of our brain to get through it, and to start to see how we can support ourselves. Because listen, before I started this business, when I first started the business, I hired a coach, and I remember saying to her, and it reminds me of what you were saying a little bit, but I remember saying to her, like, I swear I'm normally such a confident person. I'm like, I don't know, and I felt so vulnerable. I felt so much imposter syndrome with starting my business. And I think that's because I was so outside of my comfort zone. And that would just, my brain was like freaking out of like, whoa, what's this? And I look back and I'm like, geez, I've done a lot of things, and I normally feel really comfortable in certain situations, but I was comfortable in those situations, and this was something new. And so now I've reframed it. And now if I don't feel that imposter syndrome at all, if I don't feel that, if I don't see any of these signs creeping up, for me, that's a sign that I'm probably a little bit too cozy. I'm probably not pushing myself, right?
Well, that, kind of brings me around to something that I wanted to cover as well, which is, on the other side of mindset, and if we aren't able to kind of push through it, the other side of that is regret, and like how, thinking about, if I don't do this, then what? What will the what ifs be if I don't do it? And so I was re-listening to what I think is now an evergreen episode for you about mindset, where you talk about, not being a victim to the woulda, coulda, shouldas, which is kind of the ultimate regret. And listening to that episode coincided with me reading Daniel Pink's new book about the power of regret. And it really, made me think about like how, even though it is a negative emotion, and it is the second most um, common emotion that we have as humans, second only to love. Regret is our second most common emotion, and that we think of it as a negative, but how you can also use it proactively as a way to help you kind of push through these things. Like if you aren't a little bit afraid, are you thinking big enough? And if you are, and so boldness, like taking bold steps, requires, us to think about, the what ifs. And hopefully, when we think about them in terms of being on the other side of it, that we will be happy that we have made um, those bold steps. So, since that mindset episode has become, kind of a very popular one, an evergreen one, tell me about how, why you think that one has resonated so much with your audience, and like how kind of now that it is kind of evergreen, like how you'll continue to use it to work with your audience.
Yes. So now I'm like, okay, wait, which exact episode was it? But I know the content. And I think that the big underlying thing here, and I'm so glad you brought up the like mindset doesn't always look like mindset, right? It shows up in different ways. And with that, I think it's the same thing with regret. I listened to a little bit of a podcast episode with Daniel Pink talking about this. And what stuck out to me is that he was like, everyone's like, oh, like I have no regrets or no regrets, and kind of putting this idea of having no regrets on a pedestal. And he's like, that's just not the reality. Even if you say
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
not, doesn't make it true.
Mm-hmm.
And that likely people, one, maybe are just not thinking about. I think he gave some
Right.
examples of like if anyone who doesn't have regrets, it's they're either like a small child or a psychopath or they have
Right.
like brain damage,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so at the less extreme though, you may not be conscious like actively thinking about your regrets, but that doesn't mean that they're not there.
Mm-hmm.
And so being it's almost like there's this sometimes a fear of like, well, I don't want to go there. And
Mm-hmm.
I was such an emotional shover for a long time where it was like, oh, just I didn't want to feel the feelings. And so I very unconsciously, but would shove them down and just not address them. And I think that the same thing can happen with regret. If maybe we're not spending every day mulling over that you regretted something, but that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that that emotion isn't in your body. It doesn't mean that you're not feeling it or that there's certain things that would happen that would bring that up. And so I think a big part of this is just not being afraid to feel,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
And not being afraid to acknowledge that you might have regretted something. And I haven't read his book, so I don't know where he's totally going with this, but being able to look back and say, you know what, I regretted that I didn't do that, but using that as an ability to say, okay, I'm going to change how I do it in the future.
Absolutely. He talks
Recently,
about it as a motivator.
as a
Absolutely.
motivator, right? So
And
for
I
everybody
mean, he talks about a
listen to
couple of
that.
things. One is, which is something I never heard of, which are obituary parties, where people kind of like
This is
look
so
like write
interesting.
their own obituaries and say like,
Yeah.
what do I wish I had accomplished? And like,
Wow.
what do I want my obituary to say? And
Yeah.
basically, it was because of Alfred Nobel, who Nobel Prizes, where
Hmm.
they erroneously ran his obituary while he was still alive. It was his brother who died, not Alfred. I can't remember. I think his brother was Frederick. But what the obituary said was this guy was the king of death, because he created the dynamite. That's where his fortune came from, and his whole obituary was about death and destruction. And he's like, I do not want this to be how I'm remembered. And so that
Oh.
was why when he died, he left the endowment that now funds the Nobel Prizes. And so the ability to kind of proactively say, like, I would really regret if at the end of my life, this is what my
Yeah.
life looked like. And so also as a way of, when we think about our businesses and pushing through those mindset issues and taking those bold moves, like what would you regret more, trying and failing or having never tried at all? And so,
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, that's so good. That's such a
yeah,
great example. Oh,
yeah,
geez.
yeah.
Sorry. Speaking of my little fur baby, I didn't realize he was underneath me and I just kicked him by accident. Sorry, bud. Oh, that's such a good example, though. And I think, I've heard it from the other angle of, oh, think about when you're, in your 80s and sitting in a rocking chair, where do you want to be in life, and what do you want those big memories to be, and whatnot. But I think this idea of this and the tangible obituary, which is kind of, I don't know, slightly morbid to think about,
Yes.
but also, it helps you figure out what your real intentions are. And I think that's probably another way of saying what I was saying before when you were like, okay, well, how do you know if it's this or that? It's knowing what is your goal? What are your intentions? What is that main focus? And how can you stay on that path on a small scale, showing up for the launch, but on a big scale, what are those things that matter most to you? And not letting those self-sabotaging behaviors or these other mindset things that come up get in the way. And that's, I think, when you are clear on that intention on a big scale, on a small scale, it's easier to stay with that
Right. Yeah.
and not get derailed, right? And there's so many different directions to go with this, but it looked like you were going to say something, though. I don't want to cut you off.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, part of what I like to work with women about is like identifying the legacy that they want to leave. And that's another way of looking at, in order to have impact, you have to take some chances and you have to take some bold actions. And those are the kinds of things that will kind of create these mindset issues that we need to push through. And so that would be kind of keeping your eye on the prize when this is who I want to be. This is the legacy I want to leave. It makes when you have that clear in your head, that makes kind of decisions easier almost, right? I mean, it doesn't mean it's
Yes.
without risk, but it just seems clear.
It
Yeah.
does. It
Hmm.
does. And I think a big thing that I've found with becoming the go-to gal, becoming the go-to authority in your space, with building a business, with showing up as a leader, is stepping into that identity. And so taking it to the next level too, of not just, okay, what's the legacy you want to leave, right? But once you have that clarity,
Hmm.
how do you become the person who leaves that legacy? What does
Hmm.
that look like on a daily basis, a monthly
Yes.
basis, right? And
Mhm.
and helping you come back to that. One of the things, and this kind of concept can be applied to so many things in terms of how we're looking at things. So for me, a big thing that I found was I keep talking about not wanting to get out of my comfort zone or being stuck in my comfort zone, right? And I'm like, geez, maybe calling it a comfort zone isn't the best idea.
Mhm.
And so that brought on, like, okay, what if I reframed it as something else? And so what started as like, okay, well, to get out of my comfort zone, where am I trying to go? Right. So I'm like, okay, this is my growth zone. When I'm getting out of it, it's my growth zone.
Yes.
Well, what's the opposite of growing? It's interesting because we stay stuck in the growth zone, but the opposite of growth isn't standing still. I mean, to take it to the obituary point, the opposite of growing is dying.
Uh-huh.
But that's a little dramatic for me. So I called it the shrinking zone. But
Oh, I
what I
like that.
found is that there was this illusion of, if I stay in my comfort zone, I'm staying stuck. I'm staying put. I'm staying where I am. That actually isn't true, because if you stay in that comfort zone,
Mhm.
you're not standing still, you're shrinking, and you're going in the opposite direction. And that was a big motivator for me to realize, of like, okay, no, there's no such thing as standing still. There's no such thing as this even plane. So if I'm not actively in growth mode, I'm in shrinking mode.
Absolutely.
And when I looked at that as, okay, that's my litmus test of, if I don't have that little butterflies in my belly, oh, if I can go a whole week without feeling like that at all, what am I really doing? What am I really focusing on? And framing it in that context was a really good navigator to realize the importance of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that in other ways as well. I wish I could remember who it was. It was either Jonathan Stark or Blair Enns and David C. Baker. One of the two. One of the two. But they said, like, the comfort zone has now become the danger zone. Like, if you're just
Ooh.
hanging out in the middle and don't have a point of view, you're not taking a stand, you're not kind of don't have a position, like, you're just lost. And that's like, you're just like on a race to the bottom. And that in order to, to the new, like, taking some risk and taking a stand is now kind of required in order to kind of succeed and find, break out of the noise, because there's just so much noise right now with so many channels for information. And yeah, and so kind of just standing still is, you will be left behind. Like, you have to, yeah, you do have
Yeah.
to do.
There's an old quote that was recently in a Super Bowl commercial, but I don't remember which commercial it was for or who said the quote, but it's a famous quote. I don't even know if it's attributed to one person, but fortune favors the brave.
Oh, yes.
And I think that's just such a great, when we're thinking about these things, so much of it is what's the language that we're using to describe different situations, and thinking about, okay, I know fortune favors the brave. So if I'm going to get uncomfortable, right, the more chances I'm going to be brave. And you can't be brave without taking courageous action, without getting vulnerable, right? Like, literally, you have to be in some form of fear and taking action to be brave. Like, that's not the exact definition, but it's basically the definition
It is.
of bravery, right? And so in order to be stepping into that bravery, you have to be in those places, and that's what's going to bring the fortune, the good fortune, the luck, or that happenstance, the serendipitous opportunities, and all of that. So I think when we think, I don't know, thinking about, okay, well, what are the actions that you want to take that you're afraid you might regret, or what are you afraid of? A lot of times it's the people don't want, fear of rejection, or what are they're going to say no, or they're going to think I look dumb, or I'm not ready yet. It's not perfect yet. And when we can reframe those outcomes, kind of like I was talking about with my launch, where I was like, okay, well, what if I shift my focus from the results to my actions? I have more control of that, right? We can do that in those other situations too. So if it's a fear of no, what if we celebrated the no's? What if it was like, see how many no's I can get this month, right? And we weren't holding ourselves to this standard of, oh, I'm trying to, like, I'm only allowed to celebrate the yeses, and feeling like, oh, I don't want to reach out because I'm not sure if I'm going to get the yes. But what if it was a game of like, well, let me reach out and let's see if I can get 10 no's. Well, in order to get 10 no's, you're going to get yeses, right?
Right.
Oh, and so I find that being able to gamify it a bit like that for ourselves allows our brains to get on board a little bit easier and be supportive for us through this, instead of just that constant battle of resistance.
Yeah. Yeah. Just to revisit Daniel Pink, he did a survey, both first in the US, and I think 4,000 plus people, and then worldwide. And his survey showed that people have twice as many regrets about inaction than they do regrets about action. And so, those regrets of inaction, you have that perceived missed opportunity that it lasts longer, the regret is deeper, the lost opportunity is something that you kind of feel, and there's no undoing that. Whereas you can kind of undo or something that you've done, apologize or fix it or whatever. But there's no like fixing, lost opportunities. And so, yeah, taking advantage of opportunities and making sure that, when you have a goal in mind, that then you have that confidence to kind of take those steps, and that clarity to take the steps that you need to get to the next spot. So, yeah.
This is making me think of something that applies to this. I don't know if it's exactly the way that in Daniel's book you would talk about it, but I think it's important for us to talk about in this context too, because sometimes regret can be a misframing of events. So let's say I look at, I don't know, I wanted to start a business for so long. I helped my dad start his business in 2004. And then I worked for all these different entrepreneurs. And I say I was a wantrepreneur for like a solid decade. I had ideas. I made logos. Didn't really get much further past that, but there was a lot of ideas and dreaming in this stage, right? Now, I could look back and I could see in hindsight and say, oh, I had this going on. I had this opportunity. And I could tell myself a story of regret about things that I didn't do during that decade that might have set me up in a better or different way or path now, right? Or I can look through the lens of, wow, helping my dad start his business gave me this incredible insight on how he does things and how he quickly scaled and what we were able to do together, and working for these other entrepreneurs gave me all this experience and prepared me for where I am now, right? And so I can tell this story in a bunch of different ways.
Yes.
And we have that choice, right? There's not two sides to every story. There's like a million sides to every story. And we can choose, especially with our own stories, we can choose how we want to frame them to ourselves, how we want to think about them. And sure, there are going to be certain things that are like legit regret, right? Mm-hmm. But I think there may be other things that there's like, could we look at it a different way? Yeah. What if that was the thing that helped you get here now? Or what if that didn't happen and you didn't do that, then this other thing wouldn't have happened? And being able to kind of tell our own stories in ways that encourage and support us rather than bring us down and bring back to that shame and guilt and fear and stress and all of that too. So I think, one, I'm really excited to go read his book and learn more about his perspective here. But I think this whole concept of just like not being afraid to dig in and where you find these stories of regret, using them as motivation, but also like, does it have to be regret, right? Like, could we look at it a different way? Does he get on that?
You summed up very well exactly where he's going with it. Because again, he's using,
we're on the same page.
Even though it's considered a negative emotion, his whole premise is that we learn so much from these things.
Yeah.
And so regret isn't a dirty word in that way. So we don't need to say it's not a regret if we learn something from it. And one of those, like exactly what you mentioned, like he would call it your at least. Like, okay, I didn't do that, but at least I got this type of experience from it. Or, maybe in a personal realm, that wasn't the right partner, but at least I have these beautiful children. And so always looking at kind of also the upside. So you don't kind of beat yourself up over it because you made the best decision you could at the time. And you also take what's good from it. So, if I'm giving it the impression that the book is a downer,
no,
it's not, because it really is about, okay, like, we all have them. Like, regret is a uniquely human thing, right? Like who else kind of sits around and ruminates about what it shoulda, coulda? Like there isn't any other being in the known universe that does that. So so regret is part of our lives, but how do we use it productively is really what you should get out of the book. So,
yes. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're in alignment.
Yes, you are in alignment.
And my number one strength is positivity. So according to Strength Finders. So I guess I'm not surprised that, of course, my brain would think like that of, okay, well, how could this work for us instead of against?
Well, Jaclyn, this has been an amazing conversation. But so, as you know, like, one of my missions is to help build an economy that works for everyone. And one of the ways that I do it is by working with women to help get more wealth in the hands of women, because I think they do wonderful things with their wealth. And so, there's more than one way to contribute to building an economy that works for everyone. One can be working directly in the nonprofit space, but also it can also be supporting entities that do. So I am wondering if there are any organizations that have inspired you and that help support some of the causes that you like to see in the world.
Yes. So what first comes to mind for me is the Loveland Foundation, or the Loveland Therapy Fund. So I am a big proponent. I'm new to therapy in the last few years, and I grew up in a culture where therapy was like, oh, like you need therapy. It was very much like a, ooh, or like she's going to therapy, like whispered in corners. I wasn't brought up with it. I had never been to therapy before. And I started going in the beginning of the pandemic. I was really struggling with a bunch of different things. And it made such a profound impact on my life and was really powerful. And what I realized, though, is how many people don't have access to therapy. And so, one, my viewpoint on therapy has changed significantly of like, oh, wow, like, no, this is something that, is mental health is health. And I've known that for a while, but I hadn't specifically had the personal experience of working with therapists. And so it's something I feel really passionately about, that in order to be our best selves, we need to be able to feel our best. And sometimes that does mean therapy, even if you haven't had traumatic events, and realizing how limited access can be, especially to certain groups. And so what I love about the Loveland Therapy Fund is that they're able to fund therapy access for people who would normally not be able to afford it. And a big focus of theirs is on Black women and girls. And they really just want to get this support to communities that normally wouldn't be able to access it. And I love what they're doing there. I think if we can't feel our best or work through certain situations just because certain things have happened to us, right? Or certain regrets or just experiences that we had no control over, right? How can we get through that without the support in order to do the next things, right? All the resources and tools can't help through that. So I love that they have the focus on therapy. And I think that's such a key piece in helping those women in need.
Oh, I love that. And in particular, focusing on women. I mean, we do know that certainly the pandemic has hit women particularly hard. We still bear the brunt of the work at home as well as work at home as well as in our jobs. And a lot of us, had kids that were home with us during, I have a 15-year-old who was home with me for a year and a half. And it has been a pretty tough time, and obviously the people that we've lost during the pandemic as well. And so I love that. Thank you for that, and we'll certainly put that in the show notes, along with, I believe you have an offer that you'd like to talk about as well.
Well, I did mention the quiz earlier. So if you think you know which inner villain you have, or if you want to find out and validate, you can take that quiz for free. And after you take the quiz, it'll tell you which inner villain you have. And then I also follow up with an action plan specific to that inner villain, because we don't fight all villains the same.
Thank goodness.
And so even if you think you have a good idea, it's still worthwhile taking it to get that free action plan. And you can take it at jaclynmellone.com/quiz. And that's the which movie villain is sabotaging your success.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Jaclyn. This has been amazing, and I truly appreciate you spending some time with us.
I appreciate you having me on. It's been great talking with you. And I love this insightful conversation. It's so important to be getting out there.
Awesome. Thanks.